Venus in the Signs, Intro. Today we're starting a series on Venus in the signs. Venus is usually described as love, attraction, beauty, and money. That's correct, but incomplete. In a chart, Venus shows how you relate to what you want. It describes your instinct for connection, your taste, your way of giving and receiving, and the kind of experiences that feel worth having. It also shows how you handle pleasure, how you attach value to people and things, and how easily you allow yourself to enjoy what is already available. This is why Venus is not only about relationships. It's about preference. It's about selection. It's about what you move toward and what you quietly reject. Two people can want love, but mean completely different things by it. One may need directness and movement, another needs stability and time. One is drawn to stimulation, another to calm. That difference is not random. Venus explains it. The sign Venus is in shows how that instinct operates. It changes the pace, the tone, and the expectations. Some Venus placements move quickly and lose interest just as fast if there is no response. Others take their time and only open when something proves itself. Some respond to words, others to consistency, others to presence, others to intensity. The same applies to money and value. Venus describes what you consider worth investing in, what you naturally attract, and where you may either overextend or hold back. It often shows where things come easily and where they become complicated because your sense of value is not aligned with reality yet. In the natal chart, the sign gives the style, the house shows the area of life, and the aspects modify how smoothly or intensely Venus operates. So this series focuses on the sign first. We're going to look at how Venus behaves in each sign, how it approaches attraction, what it responds to, what it avoids, and where it tends to create both ease and problems if it's not understood properly. No cliches, no simplified labels, just how the placement actually works. We start with Venus in Aries. Venus in Aries. Venus in Aries does not wait. This is one of the clearest placements in the chart when it comes to attraction. There is very little confusion about interest. If they want something, they move toward it. If they don't stay out of politeness. This is a Mars-ruled Venus, so the logic of desire is active, immediate, and physical. It's not about building slowly or analyzing feelings. It's about response. There is a spark or there isn't, and that spark matters more than almost anything else. Venus in Aries is drawn to what feels alive in the moment. That can be a person, a situation, an idea, even a challenge. The common factor is that it creates movement. Something has to happen. Something has to start. If things feel static, interest drops quickly. That's one of the main traits of this placement. Attraction is tied to momentum. There's also something very honest about this placement that people either love immediately or find a little confronting. Venus in Aries is usually not interested in emotional Sudoku. They do not want to decode 12 mixed signals, wait 3 business days for a reply, consult an oracle, and then pretend they are just seeing where things go. If they like you, they want movement. If they are unsure, they will often still move just to find out. And if the energy dies, they know. That directness can actually be refreshing, because a lot of relational problems start when people refuse to say what is obvious. Venus in Aries is not great at pretending not to know. They usually know. And if they do not know, they would rather test it than sit there marinating in ambiguity. That means this placement often does very badly with passive dating culture. Too much vagueness, too much delay, too much we'll see, too much coolness for the sake of looking unbothered. All of that gets old very fast. Venus in Aries would rather have one clear no than 7 polite maybes. At least then everybody can move on with dignity. This is why Venus in Aries often initiates. They text first. They approach first. They make the first move without needing a long internal process. And they usually prefer it that way. Waiting around to be chosen does not suit this placement. At the same time, this is not random or careless attraction. It's instinctive but precise. They respond quickly because they trust their first impression. And most of the time, they are not wrong about the energy. The issue is not misreading the start. The issue is what happens after. Because Venus in Aries is built for the beginning. It's built for ignition, not maintenance. So once something becomes predictable, overly comfortable, or slow moving, the same energy that created the connection can start to fade. This does not mean they cannot stay. It means the relationship has to keep moving in some way. There has to be growth, change, interaction, challenge, or at least a sense that things are not stuck. Without that, interest turns into restlessness. This is why people with Venus in Aries often need partners who can meet them with energy. Not necessarily drama, but presence. Someone who responds. Someone who engages. Someone who has their own direction. Because if the other person becomes passive, overly dependent, or too predictable, Venus in Aries starts to feel like it is carrying the dynamic alone, and that is where frustration builds. Now, in terms of how they show affection, it is direct. They don't hint much. They don't play long games. If they like you, you will know. That can come through action more than words. Doing something, showing up, making time, initiating contact. There is a straightforward quality to how they connect. It's honest and usually easier to read than more indirect Venus placements. Sometimes the charm is in the boldness. Sometimes it is in the confidence. Sometimes it is in the total inability to hide interest once the spark is there. There can be something very endearing about somebody who is basically saying in energetic terms, yes, hello, I have noticed you, and now we are dealing with that. At the same time, patience is not their strongest point. If something feels delayed, unclear, or slow to respond, they can lose interest quickly or become irritated. Not because they need everything immediately, but because they need to feel that something is happening. Stagnation is the real problem here, not time. Another thing about Venus in Aries, this placement likes aliveness more than perfection. That is important. They are often less impressed by someone looking flawless and more impressed by someone being real, responsive, and fully there. A perfect statue is not that interesting. A living person with spark, humor, opinions, and pulse? Much better. So even though Venus is traditionally associated with sweetness and polish, Venus in Aries adds heat. This placement often enjoys a little friction. Not endless chaos, not dysfunction, not a relationship that feels like a hostage negotiation, but a little edge can be stimulating. A little contrast, a little pushback, a little play, a little tension that creates chemistry rather than destruction. This is also why some Venus in Aries people accidentally mistake adrenaline for compatibility when they are younger. Because excitement registers very strongly here. And sometimes what feels exciting is not actually healthy. It is just activating. That is one of the biggest lessons of the placement. Not everything that wakes you up is good for you. Sometimes the thing that feels intense is just unstable. Sometimes the thing that feels slower is actually solid. And Venus in Aries often matures a lot when it learns that a relationship does not have to feel like the opening scene of an action film in order to be meaningful. Although to be fair, this placement usually would prefer it not feel like customer service hold music either. There has to be some pulse. Now, this placement also has a strong independent streak. Even in relationships, they need to feel like themselves. If a connection starts to feel restrictive, controlling, or too heavy too early, they will pull back. Not necessarily because they don't care, but because they associate attraction with freedom of movement. They need space to act, to choose, to move. And this is important because people often misunderstand Venus in Aries as inconsistent or non-committal. That's not accurate. They can commit, but they commit to something that stays alive. If a relationship turns into obligation without energy, they will disconnect, even if nothing is technically wrong. So for Venus in Aries, attraction is maintained through engagement. That can be shared activity, honest communication, mutual independence, a sense that both people are choosing each other, not just staying. Now, let's talk about what they are drawn to. They tend to be attracted to strength. That does not always mean dominance, but it does mean presence. Someone who knows who they are. Someone who does not collapse under pressure. Someone who can respond directly. Confidence is attractive to this placement, but it has to be real. Artificial confidence or forced behavior is usually picked up immediately and rejected. They also respond well to people who have their own life. If everything revolves around them too quickly, it can feel suffocating. But if the other person has direction, focus, and independence, attraction tends to increase. There is also a competitive edge here, not necessarily in a negative way, but in the sense that challenge can increase interest. If something is too easy, it can lose value. If there is something to pursue, something to engage with, something to earn, that keeps the connection active. Now, let's bring this into affection style in more practical terms. Venus in Aries often shows care through initiative. They plan the thing. They send the message. They make the move. They decide quickly that something should happen and then try to make it happen. So if you are dealing with someone with this placement, do not expect their love language to always look soft and slow. Sometimes the affection is, I booked it. Sometimes it is, get in, we're going. Sometimes it is, I saw this, thought of you done. It can feel spontaneous, playful, and very alive. But the flip side is that if the effort is not met, they notice quickly. This placement can tolerate a lot, but it does not enjoy feeling like it is the only one generating energy. Once it starts to feel one-sided, irritation builds fast. And when Venus in Aries gets irritated in love, the tone can shift from flirtation to actually, never mind. Not in a tragic operatic way, more in a very efficient way. Another important layer here is pride. Venus in Aries may move first, but that does not mean it enjoys rejection repeatedly with no limit. There is courage here, yes, but there is also ego. If they feel dismissed, mocked, strung along, or made to compete for basic respect, they usually shut the door with more speed than sentiment. This placement can forgive a lot more easily than people think, but it does not like humiliation. That is where the fire hardens. Now, in terms of shadow patterns, there are a few. The first is starting quickly and losing interest just as fast. That happens when the initial spark is mistaken for long-term compatibility. Venus in Aries needs to learn the difference between ignition and sustainability. The second is impatience, ending something too early because it is not moving fast enough when in reality it just needed time to develop. The third is reacting instead of choosing. Because this placement is instinct-driven, it can move before fully understanding the situation. That works well in some cases, but not all. So part of the development here is learning when to act immediately and when to pause. Not to suppress the instinct, but to refine it. One of the best questions Venus in Aries can ask is, do I want this person, or do I want the feeling of wanting something? Because those are not always the same. Sometimes this placement gets more attached to pursuit than to partnership, to spark more than substance, to the thrill of beginning more than the reality of building. And once that becomes conscious, choices improve a lot. Because then you can still enjoy the excitement without letting it run the whole show. Now, let's bring this into money and value. Venus in Aries tends to spend quickly, not necessarily irresponsibly, but impulsively. If something feels right in the moment, they go for it. They are less interested in long deliberation and more interested in immediate usefulness or satisfaction. This can be an advantage when it comes to opportunity. They are often quicker to act than others, but it can also lead to inconsistency if there is no structure behind it. So the lesson here is not to slow down completely, but to add awareness, to recognize which impulses are aligned and which are just reactions. In terms of self-worth, Venus in Aries is closely tied to action. They feel better about themselves when they are doing something, moving forward, making decisions, taking initiative. If they feel stuck or passive, confidence can drop quickly. So their self-worth is not built through reflection alone, but through movement, through acting on what they want, through choosing instead of waiting. In long-term relationships, Venus in Aries needs room to keep being a person. This is where people sometimes get it wrong. They think commitment means total merging, total sameness, total emotional fusion. That can feel claustrophobic here. Venus in Aries usually does better when the relationship still allows individuality, movement, and independent vitality. So the healthiest version of this placement often looks like two people who genuinely choose each other, but who still have their own center of gravity. Not because they are distant, because they are alive. And that keeps desire from collapsing under routine. Because routine is the real test for Venus in Aries. Not whether they can fall in love. They can. Not whether they can be passionate. Obviously. The question is whether they can keep something meaningful alive once the novelty fades. And the answer is yes, but only if the relationship itself is allowed to evolve. This placement needs fresh air, new plans, new conversations, shared risks, momentum. Even small things help. Try a new place, change the rhythm, start something together, laugh more, move more. Do not let the relationship become one long beige hallway. That is not romance. That is an administrative condition. And if you love someone with Venus in Aries, the main thing to understand is this. Do not smother the fire, but do not ask it to perform constantly either. This placement does not need endless drama. It needs engagement. It needs honesty. It needs momentum. It needs enough freedom to keep breathing and enough response to keep caring. It wants to feel that the connection is happening now, not eventually, not theoretically, not after 6 layers of emotional bureaucracy. Now, when this placement is working well, it is one of the most attractive Venus positions. It is clear, confident, engaging, and alive. It brings energy into relationships. It creates momentum. It keeps things from becoming stale. But when it is not understood, it can feel unstable. Too fast at the beginning. Too restless later on. Too reactive instead of intentional. So the key for Venus in Aries is not to become slower or more passive. It is to become more precise. To keep the directness, but add awareness. To keep the instinct, but add timing. To keep the movement, but choose direction. Because when that happens, this placement does not just start things well. It sustains them through energy, honesty, and presence. And that is one of the best things about it. It may not always be the smoothest Venus placement. It may not always be the most patient. It may not always be subtle enough to win awards for restraint. But it is alive. And in a world full of hesitation, delay, and people pretending not to care, that kind of honesty has real value.